Imagine a man on the verge of an epic journey, a leader destined to change the fate of an entire nation. His name is Moses, one of the most enigmatic and powerful characters in the Bible. But before becoming the great liberator of the people of Israel, Moses was an ordinary person, with his own flaws and insecurities. From the beginning of his story, something intriguing catches our attention. Moses, God's chosen one, had a difficulty many of us would never imagine. Instead of being an eloquent speaker, Moses is described as someone slow of speech and tongue, a man with communication problems. But what does that mean? Was he a stutterer? Did he have a physical issue with his mouth? Or was it just a metaphor? This story leads us to question, how could a man with such a limitation in speech be chosen to confront Pharaoh and lead an entire people? How could someone with difficulties in expressing himself deliver the most important messages in human history, the laws of God? Today, we will dive into the fascinating journey of Moses, understand his weaknesses, and above all, discover how he became the greatest communicator in history, even when everything seemed to be against him. This is the story of a man who, despite his challenges, showed the world the true power of believing in what lies beyond our own limitations. Now, imagine Moses, now an adult, living in voluntary exile, far from the oppression of Egypt. One day, while tending the flock, something extraordinary happens. A bush begins to burn with flames, but the fire does not consume it. He approaches, intrigued, and hears the voice of God calling his name. Moses, Moses. At that moment, his life changes forever. God chooses him for a monumental mission to free the people of Israel from slavery, facing the absolute power of Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world. Moses, the simple shepherd, was chosen to be the leader, the redeemer of an entire nation. But something deeply troubles him. He, a man without skill in words, responds to God with raw honesty. Lord, I cannot be that person. I have never been eloquent. I am slow of speech and tongue. This statement echoes his insecurities, a confession of his weakness. He cannot imagine how someone with speaking difficulties could stand before Pharaoh and convince an empire to release thousands of slaves. And so Moses questions himself. How could God choose someone with such an obvious limitation? He feels unworthy, incapable, trapped in his own doubt. It is at this moment that the famous expression arises, uncircumcised lips, a symbol of his sense of inadequacy, as if his own mouth were an obstacle to the divine mission. Moses fears that his speech limitations will prevent him from fulfilling what God asks. But this is only the surface of his hesitation. What he does not yet know, and what we begin to understand, is that when God chooses, he does not choose based on visible talents or human abilities. There is something much greater at play. Moses is about to learn that his calling does not depend on his abilities, but on the will of the one who called him. The man who saw himself as slow of speech is about to become the voice of liberation, even without knowing how. And this, my friend, is just the beginning of Moses' transformation. Let's go back to a time of great suffering for the Hebrew people, who lived as slaves in Egypt, forced to work on pharaonic constructions and treated with extreme harshness. But as the Hebrew population grew in number, Pharaoh began to see this growing population as a threat to his power. He feared that one day the Hebrews would revolt and turn against Egypt. It was then that Pharaoh made a devastating decision, decreeing that all male Hebrew babies should be taken and thrown into the Nile River. An act of extreme cruelty which spread despair and fear among the Hebrew families. Imagine the suffering of these families, forced to hide their children, trying to escape from a cruel fate that seemed inevitable. Amidst this terrible situation, a woman of faith named Jochebed gave birth to a baby boy. She knew that if she were discovered, her son's life would be in danger. For 3 months, she managed to hide the baby, protecting him as best as she could. But as time passed, hiding a newborn became impossible. With no other options, Jochebed made a painful yet courageous decision. She prepared a basket made of reeds, waterproofed it, and placed her precious son inside, trusting that fate would carry him to a safe place. She set the basket afloat on the waters of the Nile, and with a heavy heart, let her baby drift into the hands of divine providence. As the baby floated along the waters, at the mercy of the currents, it seemed his fate was sealed. But Moses' story was only just beginning. That child, drifting on the Nile, was destined for greatness. His future would be nothing less than to liberate his people and become one of the greatest leaders in history. Thus, even in the darkest circumstances, a glimmer of hope emerged. The baby, who should have been condemned, was being protected by invisible forces, those that shape the greatest destinies. Now imagine baby Moses floating down the waters of the mighty Nile River, helpless in a basket, at the mercy of the current. His mother, Jochebed, had done what seemed impossible: entrust her son's life to the waters, praying that he would be found by someone who would give him a chance to live. And surprisingly, that's exactly what happened. At the banks of the river, something extraordinary was about to occur. Pharaoh's daughter, a princess, had come down to the river to bathe, accompanied by her servants. When she spotted the small basket floating, her curiosity was immediately piqued. With a gesture, she ordered it to be brought to her. Upon opening the basket, her eyes fell upon the crying Hebrew baby. In that moment, she understood what was before her. This was not an Egyptian child, but a Hebrew baby, the son of a people her father had ordered to eliminate. She knew very well what her father, Pharaoh, had decreed. She knew that by rescuing this child, she was directly defying her father's harshest command. But something within her compelled her to act with courage and compassion. Instead of ignoring the baby, Pharaoh's daughter made a decision that would change the course of history. She held the little Moses in her arms, and in that instant, decided he would be her son. She named him Moses, which in Hebrew means drawn from the waters, for she had rescued him from the waters of the Nile. Thus, the baby who should have been a victim of a cruel decree was now under the protection of the very palace that had ordered his capture. An unexpected act, but clearly guided by something greater. And the story still holds a surprise. Moses' sister, Miriam, who had followed the basket from a distance, watching everything, approached the princess with an intelligent and brave suggestion. She asked Pharaoh's daughter if she would like her to find a Hebrew wet nurse to care for the baby. The princess agreed, unaware that Miriam was in fact bringing Moses back to the arms of his true mother. So, against all odds, Jochebed had her son returned to her. She was able to nurse and care for Moses in the early years of his life, knowing he was protected by Egyptian royalty. When the time came, Moses was taken to the palace and raised as a prince, but he never forgot his true roots. This is the story of how little Moses, destined to be a victim of a cruel decree, was miraculously saved, embraced by the compassionate heart of Pharaoh's daughter. He was drawn from the waters to fulfill a destiny far greater than anyone could have imagined. Now imagine Moses, the baby who floated down the Nile in a basket, growing up not as a slave, but as a prince. He was taken to Pharaoh's luxurious palace, the center of Egyptian power, where he lived surrounded by wealth and privileges that most could only dream of. Moses grew up among marble columns, lush gardens, and grand corridors. He wore the finest clothes, ate the most exquisite foods, and received the best education Egypt could offer. He learned about politics, science, and military strategy, becoming a wise and powerful man in the eyes of all around him. In appearance, he was Egyptian, a member of the royal family. However, deep within, Moses knew there was something more. From a young age, he was aware of his true identity, for although he was raised as a prince, he never forgot that he was Hebrew. This was no secret to him, and this truth followed him like a silent shadow. In moments of solitude, Moses must have questioned himself. How could he, a Hebrew, live in luxury while his people suffered at the hands of the same Egyptians who raised him? He saw the Hebrews working tirelessly under the scorching sun, building Egypt's great cities and monuments. He knew that his own life of comfort was, in some way, tied to the oppression of his people. This dilemma, this duality, grew within Moses as he matured. While he was treated as a prince, he never felt he fully belonged to the world he lived in. The palace was his home, but his roots were among the Hebrews. Moses was a man between two worlds. He walked among Egyptian royalty, but his heart and conscience pulled him back to the enslaved people from whom he had been separated. This inner tension, this silent conflict, began to shape his destiny in ways he did not yet fully understand. Little did Moses know that soon, his life would take an unexpected turn. It would no longer be possible to ignore who he truly was, nor the grand destiny that awaited him. He was raised as a prince, but he was destined to be much more than that. The true calling of his life was approaching, and everything he had experienced up to that moment was preparing him for the monumental role he would play in the future. Now, imagine Moses, still a child in the palace, growing up amidst the grandeur of royalty. He was seen as part of the court, but as we know, Moses was destined for something far greater. An event that seemed innocent but was full of meaning would be the first sign of his grand future. One day, while young Moses was sitting on Pharaoh's lap, something unexpected happened. Among the many rich and opulent objects surrounding the throne, one caught the curious eye of the child: Pharaoh's own crown. As any child would, Moses reached out, took the crown, and without hesitation, placed it on his head. It might seem like childish play, right? A simple, harmless gesture. But to Pharaoh, and especially to his advisors and magicians, this was far more than a mere prank. They believed that every sign and every action carried deep significance. And when they saw Moses with the crown, Pharaoh's advisors were alarmed. "This is a sign," they exclaimed. "This boy is no ordinary child. He is destined for something greater, perhaps even to take your throne, Pharaoh. He may be the threat that will topple your reign." It was a bold accusation, and for a moment, Pharaoh hesitated. Could his kingdom be in danger because of this Hebrew child he had adopted and raised? He faced a dilemma. What should be done about Moses? Some advisors suggested that Moses was indeed a threat and that severe measures should be taken to ensure the security of the throne. But one of the advisors, more cautious, intervened. "Let's test whether what he did was out of innocence or if there's something more behind it. If he truly is a threat, a simple test will reveal his true intentions." What followed was an unusual but crucial trial. The advisors placed two bowls before young Moses, one filled with shining gold coins and the other with burning coals. The idea was simple. If Moses was drawn to the gold, it would be seen as a sign of ambition, indicating that he truly desired the throne. But if he chose the coals, it would prove that his earlier act was merely an innocent display of childlike curiosity. With all eyes fixed on the young boy, they waited for his choice. Like any child, Moses first leaned toward the gold, but then something miraculous happened. In a divine moment of intervention, the angel Gabriel, invisible to all, guided Moses' hand toward the burning coals. Innocent and unaware of the danger, Moses picked up a glowing coal and, not knowing better, placed it in his mouth. The result was immediate. He burned his tongue, and from that moment on, his speech was impaired for the rest of his life. Yet, the test was deemed a success. Pharaoh's advisors understood that, for now, Moses was no direct threat to the throne. But this simple incident, with a child playing with a crown and touching burning coals, was more than just a test of his innocence. It was an event that would mark Moses' life forever, turning him into someone with a speech impediment. Little did they know, however, that despite this limitation, Moses' destiny was far from being hindered. This physical mark, the result of a trial by fire, would become part of the grand narrative he would live out as both leader and liberator. What began as an innocent child's gesture would transform into one of the strongest symbols of how even the humble and limited can be called to a grand destiny. Now, imagine Moses, still a child in the palace, growing up amidst the grandeur of royalty. He was seen as part of the court, but as we know, Moses was destined for something much greater. A seemingly innocent yet meaningful event would be the first sign of his grand future. One day, while young Moses was sitting on Pharaoh's lap, something unexpected happened. Among the many rich and opulent objects surrounding the throne, one shone especially bright to the curious child's eyes: Pharaoh's own crown. Like any child would, Moses reached out, grabbed the crown, and without hesitation, placed it on his head. It may seem like a child's play, right? A simple, harmless gesture. But to Pharaoh, and especially to his advisors and sorcerers, this was far more than mere mischief. They believed that every sign and action carried a deeper meaning. Upon seeing Moses with the crown, Pharaoh's advisors became alarmed. "This is a sign," they said. "This boy is not ordinary. He is destined for something greater, perhaps even to take your throne, Pharaoh. He may be the threat that will bring down your reign." It was a bold accusation, and for a moment, Pharaoh hesitated. Was his kingdom in danger because of this Hebrew child he had adopted and taken in? He faced a dilemma. What to do about Moses? Some advisors suggested that Moses represented a threat and that severe measures should be taken to ensure the safety of the throne. But one of the advisors, more cautious, intervened. Let us test whether his action was out of innocence or if there is something more behind it. If he truly is a threat, a simple test will reveal his true intentions. What followed was an unusual but crucial test. The advisors placed two bowls in front of young Moses, one filled with shiny gold coins and the other with glowing hot coals. The idea was simple. If Moses was drawn to the gold, it would be seen as a sign of ambition, indicating that he might indeed desire the throne. But if he chose the coals, it would prove that his previous action was merely an innocent act of childish curiosity. With their eyes fixed on the young boy, everyone awaited his choice. Moses, like any child, initially reached for the gold. But something happened. In a divine moment of intervention, the angel Gabriel, invisible to all, guided Moses' hand toward the coals. Innocent and unaware of the danger, Moses picked up a glowing coal and, not realizing the risk, placed it in his mouth. The result was immediate. He burned his tongue, and from that moment on, his speech was impaired for the rest of his life. However, the test had succeeded. Pharaoh's advisors understood that Moses was not a direct threat to the throne at that moment. But this simple incident, a child playing with the crown and touching the coals, was not just a test of his innocence. It was an event that would mark Moses' life forever, transforming him into someone with difficulties in speech. Little did they know that despite this limitation, Moses' destiny was far from being hindered. This physical mark, the result of a test by fire, would become part of the great narrative he would live as a leader and liberator. What began as an innocent gesture by a child would turn into one of the strongest symbols of how even the most humble and limited individuals can be called to a grand destiny. Now imagine young Moses, marked by the weight of an unusual destiny. After the incident with Pharaoh's crown, Moses had already been tested, and Pharaoh's advisors thought they had resolved the issue. The test with the coals and the gold, where he, guided by divine intervention, picked up the coal and burned his tongue, left a permanent mark on his life. That burn wasn't just physical. From that moment on, Moses developed a speech difficulty, a problem that would accompany him throughout his journey. His speech became slow, heavy, marked by the struggle to pronounce certain words. What could have been an insurmountable limitation for anyone else, however, would be transformed into something far greater in God's hands. Pharaoh's advisors believed they had removed the threat. In their eyes, Moses no longer seemed like a danger to the throne. But they were far from imagining that this same boy, with impaired speech and a hand that had touched fire, was being shaped for something immeasurably grand. Moses grew up bearing the burden of his slow and difficult speech. He knew this limitation made him different from others, especially the Egyptian nobles and princes, who were trained to speak with clarity, authority, and eloquence. For a future leader, speech was one of the most important tools. Without the ability to communicate confidently, how could someone lead? But what the advisors and even Moses didn't know was that this flaw was part of a greater plan. He was marked not to be silenced, but to be a symbol that the most powerful words don't come from human perfection, but from divine purpose. This trial by fire, which seemed to have sealed his fate as someone incapable of leading, was actually preparing him for a path where human limitations would be overcome by a greater power. Moses' speech difficulty would not be the end of his story, but the beginning of one of the greatest paradoxes the world had ever seen. As Moses grew, he began to understand that, even with his impaired speech, his mission still awaited him. He didn't yet know how he would face this challenge, but one thing was certain. The young man who had touched the fire and marked his mouth was destined to carry the flame of liberation for an entire people. What seemed like a weakness would become living proof that when God has a purpose, even the coals of limitation can be transformed into a burning strength. Now imagine Moses, now an adult, living as a man marked by his history and his limitations. He had fled Egypt and was now living as a shepherd in a distant land, seemingly far from his past and his responsibilities. But no matter how hard he tried, his true calling would find him. The most transformative moment of his life was about to happen. While tending his sheep in the desert, something extraordinary crossed his path. a bush burning with flames, yet not consumed by the fire. He approached, intrigued, and there, in the presence of the supernatural, God spoke directly to him. "Moses, Moses," God called, and Moses answered. The divine mission was then revealed. Moses was chosen to liberate the Hebrew people from slavery in Egypt. The God of his ancestors was calling him to confront Pharaoh, the most powerful ruler of the time, and lead an entire nation to freedom. But Moses' heart was heavy, not only because of the magnitude of the task, but also because of his own insecurities. He, who had carried the marks of the incident with the coals since childhood, felt unprepared. How could he, with his slow and heavy speech, be the voice of liberation? How could he, who struggled to articulate words, confront Pharaoh and inspire an entire nation? Moses then expressed his doubt to God. "Who am I to go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" He was terrified by the weight of responsibility, but also by his own limitation. He knew that his speech difficulty could be an obstacle. He confessed, "Lord, I have never been eloquent. I am slow of speech and tongue." In other words, Moses was saying that he wasn't the right man for the job. He was consumed by the idea that his speech problem made him unfit to lead. Moses' doubt was profound. He saw his limitation as something that disqualified him from the mission. And who could blame him? Faced with such an immense challenge, many of us would also question our abilities. He saw himself as inadequate, powerless to lead with authority and clarity. For how could someone who struggled to speak inspire others? But here is where the true mystery lies. While Moses saw his speech as a weakness, God saw beyond. God had a plan that surpassed any human limitation. The mission entrusted to Moses didn't depend on his eloquence or perfection, but on his faith and obedience. God wasn't asking for perfection, he was asking for willingness. And despite his doubt, Moses was about to discover that the power of his leadership didn't come from his ability to speak well, but from trusting the one who had called him. This is Moses' inner struggle, a man chosen by God but consumed by doubt about his own capability. He didn't fully understand it yet, but he would soon learn that true power doesn't lie in the words that come out of the mouth, but in the strength of the one who inspires them. Now imagine Moses, there in the desert, still hesitant, his mind filled with doubts. He had confessed his greatest insecurity to God, his speech. "Lord," he said, "I am not eloquent. I am slow of speech and tongue." To Moses, his limitation seemed like an insurmountable obstacle. How could he, with difficulty expressing himself, be the spokesperson for an entire nation? And then, in the midst of this doubt, came God's response. A response that would not only change Moses' view of himself, but also the way he would approach life from that moment on. God said to him, "Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord?" With these words, God was reminding Moses that the power of speech, vision, and even limitations are controlled by him. In other words, Moses didn't need to worry about his weakness because God, the creator of all things, was in control. What seemed to Moses like an insurmountable barrier was not an obstacle for God. God continued, "Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say." Moses' mission did not depend on his own ability, but on divine guidance. God wasn't just choosing Moses despite his weakness. He was choosing Moses precisely to show that, in the kingdom of God, human weaknesses can be transformed into divine power. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. Moses, the man who saw himself as flawed and incapable, was being called to become the greatest communicator in history. Because in the end, it wasn't about the eloquence of the words, but the depth of the message he carried. A message that didn't come from him, but from God. God's answer was clear. Moses' limitation didn't disqualify him. In fact, it qualified him even more for the role God had prepared for him. Instead of choosing a great orator, someone naturally talented in speech, God chose someone who didn't trust in his own ability. In this way, the glory and power would belong entirely to God, not to man. This was the revelation that transformed Moses. Even with his doubts, he began to understand that the task before him didn't rely on his own strength, but on the God who was sending him. Moses' weakness would be overcome by divine strength. And with that answer, God not only calmed Moses' heart, but also showed him, and all of us, that when God calls, he equips, not with what we think we need, but with what he knows will be enough. Moses didn't yet know how everything would unfold, but he was beginning to understand that his weakness would be used for something far greater than he could have ever imagined.